Welcome back to part 2 of our delicious conversation with our guest, who is an author and is also the former director of the British intelligence agencies MI5 and MI6. He is also the author of Catchy the Informer, which is the third in a 5-part series. It's a book that Bear Grylls, who you might know of from these crazy American outdoor stories, said, strap yourself in, it's for one hell of a ride. He's done some amazing things. Part 1 of the show, we talked about where he came from, traveling as a child, getting these perspectives, working with the Americans, working with the British, dealing with narcotics and money laundering through the Caribbean. The guy did a lot of amazing things, working in the Foreign Office and then being part of these agencies. Very, very interesting and insightful conversation. If you didn't catch it, I highly recommend that you go back into part 1 of the show. We're going to continue on into part 2 of the show, because when we look at the idea of these agencies I talked about in part 1, we have been given a view of them that comes from books, it comes from movies, it comes from TV. That's not the same as being in the experience of anything. But at the same time, a lot of things that were hidden, whether it's through the Freedom of Information Act, come to the surface and get revealed, and we get to find out about MK Ultra and a bunch of other crazy things that went on in different agencies and etc. And of course, the thing that blew up certainly in the last 10 years, it's longer, but in the last 10 years, is the Epstein stuff, Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I am old enough, and I know you are, David, that we remember Robert Maxwell being the head of the big newspaper chain, and his daughter is Ghislaine Maxwell, who was the partner of Jeffrey Epstein. And of course, the conspiracy, because I'm not in the inside, so I have to call it that, of whether Epstein was Mossad, whether he was an agent who apparently did all kinds of business with no money and nobody ever saw him do any business. When you see stuff like that, what alarm bells go off in your head, or don't they? Or you just go, it's just crazy shit.
Well, not dealing with Epstein in particular.
No.
But one of the things that is fascinating about the job is the number of people out there who want to pretend they have something to do with the intelligence agencies. And we call them fantasists.
Right.
And although it sounds humorous, in fact, they can cause an enormous amount of trouble and work. I think, in a sense, this is becoming more prevalent because of social media.
Right.
People can say anything they like on social media. At that point, the agencies can either turn around and say, well, actually, that's clearly nonsense. Alternatively, they might have to say, well, is it? And if they say, is that nonsense, they then have to look into it to see whether or not it is. First of all, they have to go through a process to determine whether or not the information is sufficiently important and sufficiently accurate in their own view to have a look at or not. This takes time, takes money, and in most cases, obviously when this happens, it turns out that the information is fantasy and the fantasist has been behind it.
That's interesting. Some people, not all, but some people are doing it as kind of like an esteem thing.
Yes, of course.
Right, it's an ego trip. I'm part of this when they're part of nothing, but it sounds good and it impresses the chicks.
Yes. That's absolutely right. It's just like telephoning for the fire brigade. It's that sort of attitude, that sort of mentality on a spoof call.
But of course, some of that is real. We're not saying it's not real. Some of that is very real.
Yeah.
Is there anything that came out, that was revealed, that was verified, that you were surprised it came to the surface, that you were surprised that, like, wow, I didn't think that would ever come out?
No, I didn't come across that. One of the things about the agencies and the cooperation between the lawyers and the agents themselves, which again, one may look at and think, well, agents would run a mile from a law. This is nothing to do with my job. If you've got a lawyer looking over my shoulder, really?
Right.
Again, it goes back to the training and the integrity factor I was talking about. The object is to achieve protection of the state.
Yes.
Protection of the individuals in the state. So there's a common goal, which everybody has signed up to. The individuals who are employed we were talking about going back to my background from the beginning onwards because we wanted to find out who this person was. That's exactly what happens in the agency. So when a person is recruited, before that recruitment, his whole background is gone through and it's double checked. Individuals asked about the background, bank managers, all sorts of information is put into the agency's understanding of who it is they're recruiting. It's not a very comfortable process for anyone who goes through that.
No.
Because your life is laid bare.
Yes.
Absolutely. So again, it helps the understanding that we've recruited has integrity.
Yes.
So when it comes to this person believes in protecting the state, on the one hand, but is not a person who's going to go overboard protecting the state. There's a limit to where they will go. They will not go off on a frolic of their own. That's another important part. So when you have this idea of lawyers and agents, there is a natural wish to cooperate. The agents want to do a job that's not going to come unraveled. Mm-hmm. The lawyers want to do a job that doesn't trammel the agents into impossibly difficult situations because they are only allowed one way of doing an operation. When the agents come to the lawyers and say, look, we've got this idea for an operation, this is what we're going to do, the lawyer's job isn't to turn around and say, well, it's illegal, you can't possibly do that. The lawyer's job is to say, look, this way of doing it might contravene the rights of the individual or might contravene the law in a way that we can't get over. But if you reshape the operation, that will bring it both within the law and within the rights of the individual. So there's a tremendous amount of cooperation between the two, which is very interesting.
Can we go to another part of this? Like I said, my background is psychology, so I read what psychologically drives and study that deeply, what psychologically drives people. I think that the idea of people going to war is that they're driven by either basic need, as in, I'm so poor I can't get out of this and the military is going to give me another path, and or patriotism, which is often through some form of propaganda. We can say that that's positive or negative propaganda, but it's still propaganda. And then when I think about it from a agent side, I would go, then it's propaganda at an ego level, as in I get to be esteemed because I'm in an agency. And as you said, that's not an easy journey. You get into that. I would have a suspicion that there is, if not a good sense of self-esteem or self-worth, there is a hunger for self-esteem and self-worth about who I am and how I am and whether I can pull it, plus patriotism. And then there's the other side of that, which is, how do you end up going to the other side? Because in all the years of you doing it, I'm sure there were agents who were working both sides of the page. What do you think gets somebody to that place?
Yeah, funnily enough, it's sort of more mundane than that.
Okay.
Which I find interesting. It's probably because of the recruitment process that winds up with people who are not there because they're, quote, patriotic in the sense of raising the flag and yee-haw.
Right.
Because they're dangerous.
Yes.
You cannot control them, or you can't be sure that they'll be controlled. So the individuals who come into the work do it because they're really interested in that particular job. They have skills, they have analytical skills, they have person-to-person or interpersonal skills, they have communication skills, they have observation skills. These are the skills that the agencies seek out in an individual. So it's, in a sense, a very mundane process, which doesn't equal James Bond.
No, of course. But there are still people who go to the, quote, other side, and
money.
It's money.
Yeah.
It's usually money.
There have been one or two, possibly Philby, ideological.
Right.
But most people who turn do it for money. The philosophical doesn't really enter into it, which is very, very interesting from the opposite point of view, recruiting people.
So when you look at something like Edward Snowden, as an example, somebody who was inside an agency, not at the level of being an agent, a spy, but somebody who has information that person holds as that it is out of integrity to keep it covered, and that there is something very unjust happening in that process. How do you, again, you're the guy who was in the inside and now you're on the outside, how do you look at people like Edward Snowden or whoever it may be, Chelsea Manning, as the examples from America?
Yeah, I'm not allowed to comment on those particular cases because that is what I would classify as sort of operational
Sure.
information. But looking at it as a whole, there can be people who are disgruntled with the job they're doing. I can talk about, for instance, Bettany, who was an individual who went to the Russians because he was disgruntled. I think that the Bettany case was actually the case where he did not have access to a counselor or a psychiatrist and was therefore not able to unburden.
Right.
The agencies at the moment, as I've said, those sort of problems are catered for by sort of encouraging individuals to go to counsellors and psychiatrists to get those problems off their chest. That doesn't necessarily answer your question, because there will be from time to time people who are disgruntled. But I think as far as the agencies are concerned at the moment, those people have ample access to help.
I just think that it's an interesting subject, and I'll tell you why, because I've done a lot of work with groups and individuals around military PTSD. For the smarter ones who come out of that process, they often realize that they were sold a bag of tricks about what patriotism was, and they went to war against an enemy who may not have been an enemy in a real sense of the word, but that they were fighting for an idea that wasn't even their own. And so there's a disgruntledness with that we're seeing in the rise of the right in America and maybe even in the UK.
Yeah.
It's that trap. You know what I mean? It's like they got sold something and then discover, it's not, there's a buyer's remorse here.
I fully understand that. Which is why I go back as far as the agency is concerned, where really and truly one didn't sort of come across this in that sense, because patriotism is dangerous, and therefore the agencies don't recruit yeehaw patriots. They recruit people who want to do a job that is really interesting and worthwhile, I think is the right word, in the sense that they are seeking to protect the state. I think there's a different balance between protecting the state and patriotism raising the flag.
Right. But again, to push back a little, this idea of protecting the state. So let's use an example that is a real world example that likely was around when you were in that world, which is the Jimmy Savile. His connections to very powerful people and the pedophile rings and all the shit that was going on with Cyril Thorpe and all the other politicians and all that thing that was covered up. Now, I'm not saying that's by agencies, although that's possible. Certainly know that it's been made clear the police forces were involved, but it's clear that there was a cover-up and a repression of that kind of knowledge. How do we come to terms with that on the outside, particularly when it's like something to do with children? There is the argument that there was protecting the state, covering up this stuff that he and the others who were a part of his world were doing. Can you give us an understanding of that in any way?
Yes, you've hit on really obviously another important point, because your points are pretty perceptive with respect. The answer to that is oversight, and it's oversight at every single level. Oversight within the agencies with team leaders, managers, directors, and your counselors, your psychiatrists. Then above that oversight, there is the oversight of the intelligence commissioner, who anybody can complain to at any time.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody with a complaint can go to the intelligence commissioner and say, I've got a complaint against the agencies. And that complaint has to be taken up and investigated. So you've got that level. And then above that, you've got the level of the Parliamentary Intelligence Committee, which again looks into the workings of the agencies and the delivery of the agency's work by its directors and chiefs.
And I understand that, but at the same time, using the Jimmy Savile example, it was a known secret. People inside of the BBC, even inside of the music and entertainment industry, were very aware of what was going on. And people in the police department were very aware of what was going on. So the complaining didn't do enough. Even the exposure to some degree didn't do enough. Keir Starmer, who's now the leader in the UK, was the head of that whole prosecution thing and sort of bypassed everything and is now the leader of the country. It makes people not trust those things you just said.
Yeah, I think all I can tell you is that as far as the agencies are concerned, if they do go into cover-up, the damage that's done is appalling if it's found out. Absolutely appalling. I mean, look at the BBC.
Exactly.
The damage has been huge to the BBC. And I'm not commenting on anything that went on, just making the comment that the damage is there. That sort of damage would occur to the agencies.
Right.
If that's the case, who's going to trust the agencies to do their job?
That's exactly my point.
Yeah, well, exactly. But I think on the whole in this country, the agencies are trusted to do their job. I think that's a pretty fair comment.
Right.
I don't know whether you agree with that or not.
I think that there's two pieces to this. You and I are old enough to remember. If the BBC said it, it was true. It was as simple as that. It was unarguably the truth. The BBC and the Observer, the Sunday Observer and the BBC, were the truth. Now, neither of those things are trusted by anybody who's got a bit more depth of thought. Now in the United States, I'm not talking about England, in the United States, people used to trust that the CIA were doing stuff that was good for the country, that the FBI were doing things that were good for the country. The trust in those two agencies has gone out of the window, particularly in the last 10 years. And now in the United Kingdom, there's a huge amount of mistrust, as I follow the geopolitics, a huge amount of mistrust of the British government and how far left things have gone and globalists and all kinds of things. So this mistrust that you're talking about, for me, is not just agencies. Agencies are, in some ways, they're the surface level of here's who we can point a finger at, but there's a mistrust of the bodies. You know what I mean? If MI5 are taking care of it, I'm good. If MI6 are taking care of it, I know they've got our best at heart. If the CIA are doing it, you know, they're a bit dark, but I know that they're ultimately trying to do good. That's what I mean about the mistrust.
I think that's really interesting. I think there are two parts to that. Just winding up the agencies for a moment, I think that the trust that I'm talking about is a trust that if somebody has a complaint, they can go to the complaints commissioner. They can get that complaint looked into properly because he is independent or she is independent, and they have a team that go in and they look at the books and they tear the files apart and they speak to all the agents that are involved and they come up with a conclusion. That's the sort of trust. So in other words, there's a open factual basis on which that trust leans.
Yes.
On the other side of the coin, I think over the years, particularly since social media and the explosion of social media, we're beginning to get used to what we've already talked about, which is fake information.
Yes.
As the world really doesn't know, in many respects, where it is, what's true, what's false. Is this politician doing this because this has come out on some social media network? Is that politician doing the other because of what's come out? And we are generally confused.
I agree.
So the price we have to pay for that is either to reduce the freedom of information or get used to the fact that this information is out there and confusing us. And we have to train ourselves to be more discerning about what we believe in.
I agree entirely. How would you suggest we do that?
We've got to discern right from the get-go. Trump's just been inaugurated as president. One of the things he did say he was going to do is to restore freedom of information. That can only be good. On the other hand, that means that in the United States, people will have to, from the get-go, start understanding to discern, to be more discerning about what they listen to, what they see, and what they talk about. That starts in school.
Yeah.
It starts with parents, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say it starts with parents. I think that this is part of the challenge, is the inherent biases that is built in. I wrote a piece many, many years ago where I said, we think the world is run by white-haired old men. This is when I had dark hair and I was a young man. And I said, if we think the world is run by silver-haired old men, and the truth of the matter is the most influential people in the world are mothers because they whisper in the ears of their children, are children because they are learning, are artists because they're saying the things that cannot be said.
Yes.
And that's where we need to look to. But to do any of those things requires discernment, not judgment. And I think that most of us confuse the two things.
Yes.
Judgment is I've already made up my mind, and discernment is I'm willing to change my mind. Show me that I'm not seeing the entire picture. It's part of why I'm loving this conversation with you. When I work with companies and organizations and even powerful leaders, one of the things I'll say is you've got to go looking for what will breach your bias instead of what will affirm your bias, what will breach your bias, because that's going to make you a better individual. It's going to make you understand better what's really going on. And that then means that that's what you're bringing home to your family. And that's what's being whispered into the ears of your children, who are going to become teenagers who will rebel, thank goodness, and push for something better, who will become the artists of the world. And if we try and shut down the artists for saying the things they're saying because they're not socially acceptable, then we shut down the rebellion of the children, and then we've got this brainwashing family. Nothing is going to progress.
Yes, I agree. And after the years I've sort of been wandering around the planet and meeting all sorts of people from all walks of life, I couldn't agree with you more. Freedom of information is absolutely essential. Apart from being discerning, I think we have to get used to discussing problems openly. As you've already said, one has to respect the other person's point of view. It's absolutely essential. Otherwise, we just don't get anywhere.
I've just written a manifesto that I want to get to the General Assembly at the UN. It's just a small project. It's called World Peace, but
Brilliant. Oh,
no, I can't even say that without laughing because it's so egomaniacal. But the process is generous curiosity. If we can have generous curiosity with each other, with the other side, with the other way of thinking, we could do much better in conversations with the quote enemy and with our friends and with our families. Curious generosity is such a profound thing. It sounds so bloody simple and is such a discipline, particularly in this age of biases.
yes, it's incredibly difficult. I was watching the inauguration this afternoon, and one thing that came out was the idea that I think Trump called it a sea change, and I think it's been in a lot of our minds over the last year or so that we are shifting into an exponential sea change. I think I've seen 3 in my life, and this is certainly one of them. I think we are beginning to understand that if we do not talk to each other, if we don't try and understand the other person's point of view, we are just going to get into a morass of shouting at each other, because all we do at the moment is to shout.
This is very true.
Everybody knows when you see 2 kids squabbling, but nothing's going to come out of it except a set of fisticuffs.
Right. So we're going to come back for part 3 as a special episode with you, because I want to talk about your books. But to lead us into that, if only because of the title, Katya, because you and I remember the Cold War, we remember post-Cold War. Not everybody does. Does it feel like we're on the brink of a new Cold War with all the stuff we're seeing with the Ukraine and Russia and Crimea and the pushing to the Eastern Bloc?
I think there's a real danger of it, yes. There's a real danger of it. And that, I think, comes back to 2 things. First of all, we obviously cannot let Putin drive Ukraine into submission.
Right.
It's absolutely essential that we do not do that. Whether or not there is the possibility of negotiation, and I'm all for negotiation, if there's any possibility of talking, let's talk. Whether there's any possibility of negotiation that could lead to some sort of settlement that would be accepted by Ukraine, because that's the most important element of it, I don't know. One would possibly hope so. Certainly President Trump thinks there's a possibility. He's an extremely tough negotiator, and perhaps if there's anyone out there at the moment who might have the possibility of success there, he might.
It's good to hear. It's good to hear, because I can remember the TV shows and the movies and the things about a post-apocalyptic world after Russia and the US go to a nuclear war. And then we had the 90s and all the freedom of that. It was kind of like a second hippie era. Oh, this is great.
Funnily enough, it's an era that fascinates me, having been through that. I was traveling the world at that particular time. But the world of Katya is set in that time when Russia and the West were cooperating. So I created this imaginary international intelligence agency, the G8 intelligence agency, to encapsulate the time when Russia and the West were cooperating and to see how would that agency work in that sort of situation.
So you created the ideal agency.
The ideal agency.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to talk more about that in part 3. So let's dive into that. We're going to be back in just one click. So stay tuned for this delicious conversation with David. David Bickford, please tell us where you can find out more about you, about your books, etc.
Thanks very much, Dov. That's absolutely brilliant. You can find out about me on davidbickfordcb.com, social media. The books are published on Amazon, and they're in Waterstones and Hatchards in London.
Okay. We'll make sure that all those links are published. We're going to be back in just one click as we dive into the world of espionage and the world of Katya and this perfect agency we're going to be talking about in part 3 of the show. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.